Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming? Great. So I'm Jim Mallinson, the chair of the SOAS Centre for Yoga Studies, and I'm really excited this evening to be introducing our speaker, who's Dr. Professor, I'm not Professor, I think now, is that right, Jamal? Professor Jamal Jones, yeah. Congratulations. Jamal studies the literary history of southern India with particular interest in Sanskrit and Telugu. And his current research looks at intersections between poetics, ritual, and astrology in the medieval and early Deccan. And he's currently serves, I think it's a new shift, as Assistant Professor of South Asian Studies, the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is somewhere I've always wanted to get to. It's a sort of hotbed of South Asian studies. That must be a great place to be. Congratulations. Jamal was at UC Davis before that, and before that you're in Chicago, weren't you? That's right, for your PhD, which was supervised by, I think we can say, our very own Professor Whitney Cox, who was my predecessor as the Sanskrit lecturer at SOAS. Now, so I came across Jamal's work, I guess it must be 3 or 4 years ago now. I very luckily got a sort of early draft, or just as you were submitting, I think. Maybe I squeezed it out of Whitney, I can't remember. But going back, so before that, when I was sort of setting up or proposing the Hatha Yoga project, and I got called for an interview in Brussels, I remember, for, you know, it was the kind of last stage to get the grant. And the one tricky question that was thrown my way, I remember, basically they were all softballs, I think you would say over there. But the one curveball was, why are you not focusing on South India in this project? And I somehow batted it away rather ineffectually. I can't quite remember what I said, something like, oh, none of the texts were written in South India. It's not, doesn't matter, it's not important, but I kind of knew there was a problem there. And as I progressed my work on the Hatha Yoga project, it became more and more apparent that in fact South, or the Deccan in particular, was really important for the early history of Hatha Yoga. And there were some tantalizing references in some secondary literature to this poet Gaurana, who had written a Telugu text, early Telugu, called the Navanāthacaritramu, so, you know, the stories of the Nine Naths. But there was nothing more than that. And then somehow, I can't remember how I heard about it, but somehow I discovered that Jamal was working on it in Chicago. And I got a copy of the thesis early on. And that was one of those, you know, really exciting things as I read that, and it really pulled everything together. You know, luckily we've got Jamal to tell us more about it, because he obviously knows it much better than I do. But there were various things. One in particular stood out. So one of the texts that, you know, the earliest text we were working on, the Amrita Siddhi, is actually mentioned in the text. And Virupa, its author, it's one of the very few Indian mentions of Virupa as a, you know, in the context of Hatha Yoga and the Nāths. So, and that just kind of blew my mind, to be honest, and set off all kinds of fascinating things, which ideas I'm yet to write them all down, and I've had a lot of engagement with Jamal over the intervening period. So, and we tried to get him to SOAS a few times. One of the few benefits of lockdown and all this care, because it didn't work out, you had too much teaching and, you know, the timings weren't right, but one of the benefits of this lockdown is that we can get people from all over the world to speak to us. So with that, I could go on for ages, but yeah, thanks so much for agreeing to speak to us. And I'm very excited to hear your talk on Yogis empowered and imperiled in the Telugu account of the Nine Naths. Over to you, Jamal.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out today. I know that, yeah, as Theo said, there's a lot going on in the world. So I appreciate your coming to listen, and you know, hopefully, I mean, we can have ample time in the Q&A. I'm still learning about the text in many ways, and so I'm really excited to be able to engage with this community on the subject. So let me get the screen share going to pull up my sort of handful of slides. In the meantime, I want to kind of reiterate sort of thanks to Theo, thanks to Jim for bringing me and inviting me. So is the screen share showing up all right? Good? Okay. Let's see how this goes. So just going to launch into it. Composed in Telugu during the early 15th century, Gaurana's Navanāthacaritramu narrates the travails of Nath and his band of yogi disciples. Often cited as a key document of the Nāth Sampradāya's history in the medieval Deccan, the poem and its poet Gaurana are also said to represent Andhra's Virashaiva community, this Shaiva kind of heterodox group. This connection, the literary historians maintain, is evident from his use of the Dvipada verse form favored by the Virashaiva poets, as well as his patron, the monastic potentate Muktishanta Bhikshavriti Raya's apparent leadership role within Srisailam's Virashaiva community. So I won't speak too much on the poetic form immediately, though I'm happy to talk about it if I think there are interesting things to say there. But I won't say much immediately now. I'm happy to discuss it in questions. But today I really want to think about kind of the larger kind of structure and sort of thematic and narrative appearance of the Navanāthacaritramu and ask how we can kind of think through some of these affiliations and connections between the Nāths and the Virashaivas. And to what extent it's even desirable to sort of label the work in a particular way. To preview my position, I want to suggest that the Navanāthacaritramu is not quite a Nāth text, if by that we mean a text of the Nāth Sampradāya. I think we find suggestive parallels to even nascent formations of the Sampradāya as we know it. But beyond that, Gaurana's poem represents the Nāths in a way as a little bit of a legendary project. Thus, I think we would miss a lot of what the text does if we sort of only look forward to the Sampradāya. Similarly, as we might put aside the focus on the Sampradāya, I think that focusing too narrowly on a kind of Virashaiva reading of the text also looks for kind of too much coherence and limits what we might get out of the Navanāthacaritramu. So taking a broader look, I would instead concentrate on the poem's persistent interest in ascetic power. And I think that this, in particular, helps us to make better sense of the poem, the poet, and how these connect to the religious and political culture of Srisailam. So Gaurana's Navanāthacaritramu stands as one of the earliest collections of narratives on the siddhas that would be deemed the founding fathers of the Nāth Sampradāya. According to David White, the text contains the earliest list of 9 Naths that matches those recognized by the contemporary Sampradāya. That said, in any immediate sense, it's difficult to label Gaurana's composition a work of the Nāth Sampradāya, at least as it's been described in recent years. So there's no formal institutional structures that are represented in the text, and his siddhas rarely, if at all, offer expository discourses detailing any kind of like Natha doctrine. And with the exception of Goraksha's encounter with Allama Prabhu, the siddhas do not debate or compete with yogis and adepts of rival traditions. So in that sense, it's in a way hard to maybe define them as against other kind of yogic tradition, perhaps. And this is predictable to agree. For one, aside from Matsendra, Chaurangi, and Goraksha, Gaurana's Nāths do not overwhelmingly match figures listed in certain other texts of the period. And literary texts are what I know best in that regard, on that statement. So further, Gaurana mentions nothing of the Nāths being subdivided into 12 punths, which has been taken as a key marker of Nāth identity. And further, as Jamal here has suggested, we don't have a sort of really firm articulation of a kind of Nāth identity earlier than the 17th century. And I think what we find in Gaurana's work corroborates that. So, I mean, aside from kind of how the Nāths appear, or rather, aside from the appearance of figures that the Sampradāya ultimately claims, the basic warrant for labeling the text a kind of Nāth text has been the title of the work and indeed its subject matter. But I would suggest that even here, there's a little bit of ambiguity and flexibility, as not all of the figures noted in the text actually carry the appellation Nāth. Some, such as, so you can see here a kind of list of the Nāths mentioned in the Navanāthacaritramu. some of these, in fact, do not carry the label Nath at all. So in particular, Nagarjuna and Buddha. And Gaurana seems to use some of these labels of Nath and siddha and yogi interchangeably. So nevertheless, I would say, I mean, we can see a lot that is interesting when we are in fact thinking ahead to the Nāth Sampradāya. And particularly, we find Gaurana offering a very strong and detailed sartorial description of not all of the Nāths and siddhas mentioned, but Matsendra in particular. And we can see here that Matsendra, in fact, displays some sort of telltale signs, such as the shining triple smear of ash, which marks him as a Shaiva, and which is seen to be commonplace among Nāths today. We also find him additionally holding Rudraksamala and a Nadamu, the text says, but not exactly using the terminology of the Singhnadjanu. However, aside from these sort of markers, particular markers, we don't in fact get some of the other kind of telltale signs, in particular the ear-splitting piercings that are taken to be kind of characteristic of the Nāth yogi. Beyond, I would say, these outward signs, the Gaurana depicts his siddhas as in fact, as masters of yoga and possessors of marvelous powers. And in this, he follows much of the sort of understanding of Goraksha, Matsendra, and other Nāths and sort of pre-modern texts on yoga, yogic and tantric traditions. And from the beginning of the work, in fact, Matsendra is represented as a practitioner of yoga, and he and the other signers are seen practicing, in particular, sort of contemplative and sort of breathing-based yogic practices. So first and foremost, Matsendra promotes and practices contemplative yoga oriented towards sort of extreme acts of concentration, culminating in samadhi. And in the course of the narrative, the devoted cowherd who eventually becomes the chief Natha, Goraksha, discovers Minanatha, Matsendra, engaging precisely in this kind of practice. And later it is in a contemplative technique that Matsendra guides the prince Sarangadhara, who ultimately becomes Shaurangi. Here, Matsendra explicitly describes the technique as a royal or kingly yoga. So the Telugu here is Rajuli yoga, but just as well could have been Raja yoga. Such labeling identifies it with conceptions of Raja Yoga known from Sanskrit texts, in which the forebears of the Nāth Sampradāya would synthesize with Hatha Yoga. And in fact, it is this contemplative yoga that appears to be a central path to bodily power in the Navanāthacaritramu. Now, so this technique is particularly on display in the story of Chaurangi, when he is, as the story goes, regenerating his limbs. So Matsendra, in this case, puts this mutilated prince into the siddha posture, and then he leads him into a state of deep yogic concentration, wherein he recalls Shiva Yoga's teachings on yoga. He visualizes his limbs, their divinities, their number, their sensations, and then it is through this practice that the prince Sarangadhara is able to regenerate his limbs. Sort of interesting point here is, in fact, that Matsendra also throws a stone up into the air and asks that to be the point of concentration for the prince. And he actually has him concentrate on it and keep it afloat. But we can see, in fact, that visualized here in this slide. That was the sort of background image for the social media advertisement. Let me go forward again. Now, it's through this practice ultimately that Sarangadhara is able to grow a perfected body, a siddha deha, and it's through this event that garners him his name Chaurangi, four-limbed one. Now, while this sort of meditative Raja Yoga appears to undergird much of the sort of bodily practices depicted in the Navanāthacaritramu, there is an explicitly sort of Kundalini focused sort of Hatha Yoga practice that is also depicted, that allows the siddhas to manipulate theirs and others' bodies in spectacular ways. Now, the word Hatha, or in any form, never appears in the work, but by deploying some of the language around the Kundalini, Gaurana nevertheless displays and deploys the vocabulary associated with these practices. Now, I think the other interesting thing here about this episode where this language is used, which is when Matsendrata enters the body of a dead king, is that rather than this power, this being just a siddhi that a yogi might use at will, it is sort of represented as a technique, sort of actively employed and deployed in the passage. So we have here Gaurana's description of Matsendrata entering the body of a king. And so here he says, after straightaway entering a mountain cave, he sat in the siddha posture and, putting his mind firmly on Shiva, that foremost of siddhas, brought his breath under control, drew it upward, made himself firm as the kundalini stretch, properly broke the 3 knots, gently brought the kundali upward, wondrously shined as one rich in ancient yoga, and through all the paths of the 10 doors, and assuming an immensely subtle form, he took on a luminous form and went forth. As his disciples, amazed, looked on, and Minanata's Atma then reached the king's body. So he is using this practice, controlling his breath, manipulating the kundali, as a way of affecting the siddhi of parakaya pravesha, the sort of entering or possessing another's body. And in this way, I mean, Gaurana, is really kind of bearing witness to the sort of our larger sort of sense of Matsendrata as having this seminal role in the early history of Hatha Yoga. And, as Jim mentioned in the introduction, he does this in other ways, in particular by producing this attribution of this text, which he calls the Amrita Siddhi to Virupaksha Natha. So with these things, this the depiction of the yogi's appearance, the depiction of certain yogic practices themselves, and even in this kind of textual understanding or representation of this sort of textual culture with the Amrita Siddhi, he's really presenting a sort of general a sort of picture of the siddhas that accords with sort of our larger sense of how the sort of nascent tradition looked at the period. In particular, I mean, he's also kind of showing the sort of synthesis between different sorts of yogic systems. Now, beyond simply yogic practices, sort of contemplative and corporeal exercises, the Navanāthacaritramu also sort of produces or reproduces the image of the Nāths as siddhas, in the sense of, practicing a range of sort of alchemical techniques. And sort of being interested in herbs and sort of magical substances. So I would say, in contrast to the yogic sequences, Gaurana actually offers little description of sort of actual alchemical methods. Sort of the most we get is that he will show a siddha assuming a yogic posture, a siddhasana, visualizing Shiva along with the divinities and the mantras and of Mercury. And that's sort of the depth that we get in terms of describing alchemy. But even here, right, I mean, we have some sort of commonplaces, right? Gaurana is emphasizing alchemy as an oriented or rasa here. And he has them actually in the early chapters of the work, where they're not actually undertaking any kind of alchemical sort of experiments, let's say, we do have them like seeking out and discovering, say, depositories of mercury in the mountainous wilderness. But it's only towards the end of the story, in particular in the story of Nagarjuna Siddha's student, that we actually kind of see a Siddha actively engaging in some kind of alchemical act. But again, here, his precise methods are obscure. Beyond the interest in sort of mercury-based alchemy, the siddhas here also, the text generally shows this sort of deep interest in sort of magical substances, particularly magical herbs or aushadhas. Again, these are vaguely described. We simply have them sort of discovering them in the wilderness again, or throwing them, say, into a fire when they're doing some sort of mercurial alchemy. But aside from that, aside from the interest in herbs, we also have them interested in other substances. In particular, there's a very interesting story of them being interested in kind of magical fauna. In this case, a bird that, depending on which part of it you eat, will grant you long life, kind of royal sovereignty, or siddhahood itself. That's sort of a brief kind of rundown of the sort of yogic and alchemical sort of practices that are sort of depicted in the Navanāthacaritramu. But I would say that, these are only sort of small portions of the text in a way. And while they sort of affirm and sort of offer very interesting descriptions of the Naths, and I think in particular, I think the other thing that we get is we do get this kind of these descriptions of Natha and siddha lineages. So here, this chart displays just the Naths who are sort of actively sort of portrayed in the text, who we have sort of who the narratives are about. In this case, it's much more than the 9 Naths technically. But we also have a sort of a longer list in a later chapter of many more disciples. But these are just sort of listed and named. I'm happy to sort of discuss that in the questions. So I think given the kind of the limited scope, in a sense, of the sort of some of the material, I think it's interesting to ask, in a way, kind of what is the Navanāthacaritramu about more broadly? Because I kind of, and how should we read it? What should we get out of it? Now, sort of other ways of reading it have focused on Gaurana and the sort of Poetics, and in particular, sort of thought through his connections, or sort of posited a connection between him and the Virashaivas, who are the prominent sort of group and movement, disparate as it may have been, at Srisailam. And largely this is because of the verse form of the poem, and it's written in a form called Telugu Dvipada, which is sort of highly associated and favored by Telugu Virashaiva poets. But I would just say in brief that beyond this, beyond the sort of fact of the form, Gaurana doesn't otherwise kind of show the marks of a Virashaiva poet. He doesn't claim the kind of affiliations that they do. And in fact, in his other work, so his other major works that I've worked on, and I'm continuing to work on, is this text on poetics and astrology called the Lakshana Deepika, wherein he really, he sort of shows himself in a way to be a very kind of sort of Brahmin oriented sort of figure. And much of his work in Sanskrit, at least, is interested in sort of shoring up certain kinds of Brahmanical prerogatives. And I think largely, we can see his sort of description of himself at the beginning of the work sort of shows not the kind of Virashaiva style of introduction, wherein you sort of claim Shiva and Parvati as your parents and other Shiva bhaktas as your kin, but he is sort of a more sort of traditional, let's say, kind of way of orienting himself in the social world, by in particular orienting himself around his father, and in this case his uncle, who was attached to the Recharla king of the dynasty that was sort of prominent in Andhra, particularly in the sort of from the middle of the 13th century into the sort of late the middle of the 14th century to the late 15th, early 16th century. I would say the other way in which the text often gets associated with the Virashaivas is because there's an episode in the fifth chapter. You can see it on the sort of bottom right of the corner of this slide, where Gauraksha engages with the Virashaiva sort of saint and siddha Allama Prabhu. And in this episode, they sort of debate and sort of challenge each other's bodily siddhis, and ultimately Allama Prabhu, the Virashaiva, wins and takes Gauraksha as his disciple. Now, in this case, I think that's a very, in a way, a strong point that would affiliate the text with the Virashaiva sort of world, textual culture, and I think I don't mean to dismiss it. But I also want to note that that this story is sort of exceptional. One, there are no other mentions of sort of Virashaivas in the text, Virashaiva doctrines. And on the other hand, it in fact, it's in a kind of underwhelming narrative position, let's say. It's not in fact the end of the text, which maybe we might expect if we were to say that, okay, well, Gaurana's given this account of the Nāths, and he then, at the end wants to simply subsume them within the Viramaheshwara tradition. I think there is some of that there, but in fact, the story, the text as we have it, goes on for four more not insignificant stories. And so I want to say that, I think this makes us ask kind of what's going on with this text? Maybe what else might we kind of get out of it, aside from just tracking these affiliations? Maybe what's the narrative argument? And I would say thematically, I mean, if we want to sort of think about the kind of narrative argument, and sort of the larger, I don't know, point or instruction, if you will, if we want to look for those kinds of things from a literary work, I'd say that it's really concerned with, really kind of obsessed with siddha power, yogic power, alchemical power in the political sphere. And in particular with sort of connections between these siddhas and Nāths and kings. Now, these kinds of liaisons between kings and siddhas are actually very commonplace in Indian romances, right, and Indian story literature. They're also very commonly fraught. We often find, siddhas sort of enacting some kind of occult ritual to achieve sort of their sort of siddha powers, their supernatural godlike sovereignty. And in these sorts of narratives, kings, for their part, often appear in one or two roles. They may be there to guard the siddha from the kinds of like fiendish beings that are, sort of summoned and roused in the course of these sort of esoteric activities. And, as sort of, a recompense, as a gift for doing this work, they often get something like a magic sword that will kind of amplify the fortunes of their royal house. Or else, in some of the more sort of disturbing scenarios, kings actually sort of arrive on the scene to sort of foil, often to decapitate evil siddhas who require, human or often maiden sacrifices for their rights. In both of these cases, the sort of kingly figure sort of appears as a kind of the role of a kind of protector, securing the scene and the larger moral order. And the siddhas, in contrast, are these kind of, they stand in some kind of shadow. And this is where David White fairly recently has sort of argued that in the sort of pan-Indic imagination, the siddha yogi is fundamentally a sinister yogi. An adept who employs occult procedures to gain power and possession of others, especially royalty. And even when the siddha is maybe not sort of evil, let's say, or depraved, he's still kind of a dubious and maybe self-absorbed character. But this is not really how it goes in Gaurana's Navanāthacaritramu. right? It's, it definitely sort of details the exploits of yogis and siddhas, and in fact, it also agrees to this point that that the relationships between siddhas and kings are generally problematic. The difference here is that it identifies a different source for this problem. Siddhas in this text, they do seek power, right, in the means that I've described above and earlier, but in a way it's actually not clear why they do it, because even insofar as they're attaining their powers, the best that I can see in the text is that they do so, for his own sake in a way, but they only use their powers in service of others. They don't seem to use it for their own gain. And when they do, it's criticized that they're doing this. Kings, on the other hand, are categorically depicted in the text as, kind of walking this sort of selfish path, always in pursuit of power, in pursuit of pleasure. And this often has really terrible consequences. At the very least, it simply kind of threatens the sort of larger sort of soteriological goals of sort of yogic practice, of the siddha teachings that Matendra and his disciples are offering. And in this case, they're simply kind of disruptive or disappointing, but often, and sort of more dramatically, they're often displayed as having, in fact, kind of like, dangerous and deadly consequences. And so what we walk away with, I would say, from the Navanāthacaritramu, is that we walk away with an image not of a sinister yogi, but of a sinister sovereign. So hold it there for a moment. So what is the problem with kings? So fundamentally, there's the text is sort of depicting an incompatibility between sort of the royal class and sort of yogic practices and the sort of the things that siddhas do. And I think this runs through the whole text, which we see. I mean, so it starts with the birth of Matendra, but very quickly in the first chapter, this bleeds into the second chapter, goes to the story of Prince Sarangadhara, who is ultimately to become the Nāth siddha Charangi. And I think that this problem with kings and their sort of relationship to the siddha path is articulated first here in a really dramatic way. And the story of this, which is known in other versions, and the prince here goes by other names in other parts of India, is that Sarangadhara is born to this king Raja Mahendra and his chief queen Ratnangi as a result of their sort of ritual devotion to Shiva. And he grows up, he's beautiful specimen of young manhood, and he's pledged to wed an ally princess. But one day, while his father, the king, is out hunting, the prince and his friends are sort of play racing their pet pigeons. And the prince's bird, of course, wins, but upon winning, loses its way and upon seeing a beautiful parrot. And it's by this sight that it's lured into the quarters of Chitrangi, one of the king's other wives. Now, the prince sees this and decides to go fetch the bird. His best friend, in this case, the chief minister's son, advises him against it, advises him against going to see Chitrangi while his father is away. Largely out of this kind of misogynistic argument that about the inherent corruption of women. But the prince goes ahead anyway. And the Queen Chitrangi, aroused by the prince's beauty, propositions him when he comes for the bird. The prince rebuffs her. Chitrangi is angered and humiliated and vows revenge, and resolves to accuse Sarangadhara of sexual assault, essentially. Now, the king comes back from the hunt after this has all gone down and goes to see Chitrangi, and he finds her sort of despondent, and this is when she levels her accusation. And the king, ultimately enraged, decides that his son has to be punished somehow. Like, this is, he's gone too far. And he sends the prince to the forest with 2 soldiers who cut off his limbs. Now, it's after this is done, after the prince has been mutilated, unjustly by the text terms, that his agonizing moans are heard by Matsyendra, who then rescues Sarangadatta and brings him back to his cave dwelling. And he sort of nourishes the prince to health with the aid, I should note here, of the cowherd who becomes Goraksha, who's been bringing Matsyendra milk. And so instructing the prince in this Raja Yoga I had mentioned earlier, he helps him to grow back his limbs, and then ultimately, once the prince has been regenerated, gives him and initiates him under the title of Chaurangi. At this point, now the story goes on to give sort of more of this, and we'll break it down in a moment. Matsyendra, after initiating Chaurangi, decides that he needs to go on a trip to the mountains to seek out magical herbs. And he leaves Chaurangi at the cave and orders him to wait for and initiate this cowherd who had sort of become Nath's devotee and was supplying him with milk. But after Matsyendra leaves, the prince sort of becomes curious about the world, and he becomes curious about the fact that he has these like new powers, right? These siddhas. And he leaves the caves, he disobeys Matsyendra. And after he's left, the cowherd comes and waits patiently. But eventually Chaurangi, who's left and sort of gone on his own sort of walkabout of a kind, finds Matsyendra. And Matsyendra, running into Chaurangi, out in the mountains essentially, becomes very angry, and then he goes on to sort of disparage Chaurangi's disloyalty, as well as the sort of general disloyalty displayed by Kshatriyas. And he curses Chaurangi at the end of this part of the narrative to actually be without his own lineage of disciples. So there's a lot there, but I sort of want to sort of think about like what we should make of this story. And for one, Gaurana sort of invokes the problem of sort of royal desire from the very beginning in his allusions to the hunt and sort of vice and sort of sexual desire. But the problem really emerges once Sarangadatta has sort of regenerated and fails to keep his word. Chaurangi leaves his post and goes about experimenting. In particular, he experiments with his Vaksiddhi, his ability to make whatever he says the truth, sort of the state of things. But after Matsyendra sort of runs into Chaurangi out in the mountains, he's understandably angry that he's been disobeyed, but his sort of reprimand of Chaurangi is sort of based in his sort of innate character as a Kshatriya. And so Matsyendra in particular makes this analogy saying, plant a neem seed in the ground. Will it bring joy and wondrously grow into a tree of mango, sweet and lovely? Make a camphor-scented watering trench, fill a golden vessel with good water and pour it in. Will an onion lose its old odor and grow, gifting the scent of a flowering tree? So, I mean, in a way, we can read this as Matsyendra kind of scolding Chaurangi, but also saying, what else could I expect? This it's only sort of this princess, this Kshatriya's sort of innate nature coming to fruition that has sort of resulted in him disobeying me and sort of just wanting to kind of sport in his own power. And I think in a way, I mean, this brings up, I think, ultimately, and sort of signals ultimately a question of motivation and intent in the text. So we have to remember that Sarangadatta didn't actually intentionally give up his royal identity, right? He was cast out of the royal world by his father, and he happened to be a beneficiary of Matsyendra's compassion. Sort of Matsyendra, in his compassion, sort of makes Sarangadatta into the siddha Chaurangi and gives him these great powers. But it's not as if the prince actually wanted to, he didn't renounce anything. And if anything, he only wanted to be saved from his mutilated condition. And once he was a siddha, he was simply kind of self-satisfied with his powers. And I sort of mentioned this as a question of intent, precisely because we can see in sort of the other narratives that follow, in particular, when we get to the chapter 3 and we're looking at the story of an initiation of Virupaksha, that this, much of these initiation stories that follow are very much sort of concerned with the intent and the sort of true actual commitment of the people who become siddhas, who want to become Matsyendara's disciples, their intent and their commitment to becoming siddhas and in fact renouncing sort of their royal power and their ambition. And I think it's worth noting that many of the sort of people who become these sort of nine Naths, who become disciples of Matsyendara, do in fact come from these princely lineages. So for instance, Virupaksha actually comes to Matsyendara willingly and does in fact seek him out in a way, but it's Matsyendara grills him and sort of has to sort of test his commitment. And Virupaksha has to respond with his own sort of life story to explain why in fact he's no longer committed to his sort of royal power in any way. But even then, I should note that Matsyendara doesn't believe them. He's ultimately suspicious and refuses. He only agrees, actually, not after Virupaksha and as well as Nagarjuna in the fourth canto give their stories, but he has to have a sort of divine witness to their sort of commitment. So either a voice from the sky or in some cases Shiva himself will appear to say, like, look, Matsyendara, give them a break. They're being honest here. So it's okay to bring them into the tradition. Now, sort of in marking this sort of conflict and this concern with kind of the sort of acquisition and the sort of use of yoga powers, the Navanāthacaritramu is again engaging with a sort of an older theme that comes out in sort of the more technical manuals that sort of distinguish between practicing these arts, these techniques for the purpose of actually sort of achieving and enjoying the siddhis. So this is what we could call the Mumuksu perspective, versus sort of engaging in yoga practices, undertaking these sort of techniques for the purpose of the greater siddhi, or the greatest siddhi, the mahasiddhi of liberation or moksha. And this is what we could call the Mumuksu practice or orientation. And so we have yogic manuals sort of and traditions sort of taking different sides in this, and sort of what the extent to which it's permissible and sort of to actually sort of seek yogic powers for their own sake and to use them and enjoy them. And we have sort of more sort of tantric leaning texts maybe taking the role, the sort of orientation that maybe it's okay to actually indulge in the siddhis to some extent. The Navanāthacaritramu very clearly, I think, does not take a kind of bubuksu perspective, right? It doesn't, it's very interested in yogis and the siddhas not sort of really using their powers for the sake of power in the kind of worldly sense, right? Luxuriant and sort of political achievement. But I think, it's really interested, in fact, in dramatizing this tension, and it dramatizes it precisely through these sort of stories of these kings and princes, and who are sort of basically coming to yogic and siddha practices with a very different orientation, and maybe, in fact, congenitally afflicted with the qualities of arrogance and selfishness and pride. which would make them a poor fit for the kind of siddha tradition, the sort of ascetic renunciant tradition that the Matsyendra of the Navanāthacaritramu is the head of. And I would say that this larger tension is, we should see it here precisely because, right, like in a way, it's also not just a problem with kings, right? I mean, I think there's a way in which, on the one hand, Gauraksha stands in direct contrast to Sarangadhara or Charangi. He becomes, in the course of the text, Matsyendra's chief disciple. And in fact, his sort of more, let's say, meager position as a cowherd is precisely valorized by Matsyendra when he finally initiates Gauraksha. Right, and it's sort of his sort of cowherd orientation is sort of recognized in a way as a kind of like transferable skill, if we want to use the kind of present market language, right? He says, and since you, deliberating with wisdom, ward the cattle of the senses without letting them wander, I give you the fine name of the cowherd or Gauraksha. So in a way, Matsyendra is saying that, you know, a yogi is just a cowherd in a way, just a cowherd of different kinds of cattle. And in this way, he's also sort of drawing a distinct contrast between him and the Kshatriya Chaurangi from, you know, very early in the text. But I think we also have to note that even Gauraksha misses the mark. And we see this in this encounter with Allama Prabhu, the Virashaiva sort of siddha saint. I think, you know, I've marked this as a way in which this Nāth siddha tradition is being, you know, subsumed within the Virashaiva tradition. But I would also say that it more broadly, and maybe more in line with the rest of the text, is actually just sort of articulating and dramatizing again this mumuksu bubukshu distinction, because the precise contrast between the kinds of siddhis that are being sort of narrated here, and sort of that their debate that Gauraksha and Allama Prabhu are debating is about their bodies. And Gauraksha, for his part, through his siddhis, has a vajradeha, an adamantine body, which, you know, is invincible, but, you know, because it's highly solid. Allama, on the other hand, has a shunya deha, the sort of empty, ethereal body, which the text praises as a pure ascetic achievement that is, you know, even less bound to sort of material concerns. And when Gauraksha realizes this, the text says that Allama Prabhu has in fact shed him of his arrogance and his envy, and has caused the final layer of Gauraksha's own delusion to fall away. So in this case, Gauraksha, even here, even though he's on one hand been distinguished from a Kshatriya, he's still being brought into this, into their sphere, insofar as he too is marked by these same defects. Now, I'm going to sort of run through some of this a little more quickly so we have time for questions. But I want to say that in a way, like, the story is not just about whether or not kings make good yogis and make good siddhas. The text is also very much about whether siddha yogis should interact with kings, with political powers perhaps, at all. Because kings are not just bad disciples, but they can be very bad or even treacherous allies. And this again stems from their sort of congenital sort of selfishness, arrogance, and their sort of fundamental orientation towards the pursuit of power and pleasure. And these stories are, and these themes are foregrounded in the sort of later stories of the text, which are about Gauraksha and Nagarjuna Siddha's students. And so here, for instance, in the story of Vyali, we have a siddha who's engaging in alchemical techniques and has a kind of recipe for immortality that the king tries to steal from him, and ultimately tries to boil the siddha alive in a vat of boiling oil after he steals the recipe. In fact, he does boil the siddha alive. So he steals it, but we have this as this kind of cautionary tale. We have this other tale of the story of Gorakuru, who is Goraksha's student, who gets to live at the end of the story, but the king is no better, because Goraka, in this case, has the Akarshana siddhi, the power of possession and or attraction and acquisition, which the king wants the siddha to use for him, but after the siddha refuses, the king thinks that the siddha is actually going to use his Akarshana siddhi, his power to attract and acquire things, to take the things that the king himself has. And so, and here the king is kind of seeing this Gorakuru, the siddha, as precisely this kind of sinister yogi competitor in the realm of royal power. The siddha is not, but nonetheless, the king, after being refused by the siddha, tries to have him killed by assassins. But I think the sort of starkest story that we get in terms of the sort of incompatibility between siddhas and kings is actually in the final story, the story of Gaurantaka, Gaurantaka siddha, who enters the story after, which is in fact about a king named Krishna Kandara, who after a series of events where he brings misfortune upon his kingdom, tries to then, he finds a kind of, in the misfortune in the form of disease, he finds a sort of magical reservoir of water, which he tries to kind of exploit and sort of channel to his city. And so, but in the course of sort of ordering and engineering this public works project to sort of siphon the waters of this sort of magical tank, the workers, in fact, sort of pierce a hole into the underworld and anger a divinity down there, who and they end up draining the waters and bringing kind of further misfortune upon the city. But there is, a way out that the deity offers, which is human sacrifice. And in response to this, the king ultimately proves willing to sacrifice his own people to maintain and replenish the site, and replenish the water and appease the god. His subjects, expectedly do not take well to this. And I think in here, I mean, we find, again, a familiar theme, which is the king's kind of ambivalent and maybe even impure position as a sort of agent of maintaining the social order through violence. But here, in fact, I would say, like, this story actually finds him, finds that whole function being, fully perverted, where, the king, Krishna Kandara, whether he wants to or not, is brought to a point where he, by his own desires and interests, has to set his own sovereign force against his own people. The only way out that we get is ultimately from this siddha Gaurantaka, who sort of arrives at the town at a sort of at the last moment, and sort of agrees to sort of stand in for the sort of subjects of the kingdom that might have otherwise been sacrificed. But before doing so, he has to criticize the king, and he says, "O king, in killing so many people as they wail, just so the waters of the tank might stand here again, what reward comes to you through such a cruel act? When you think of a world protector's dharma, is this it?" So here, he, in a way, I mean, the siddha is marking the king's, acts here as sort of fundamentally at odds with his sort of imperative to safeguard his realm. But ultimately, I mean, the way that the siddha is able to sort of save the day is by, in fact, sort of, in a way, plugging the hole. That the text is actually very broken here. So what happens in this final sort of ritual is unclear, but it seems that the siddha is sort of interred or something in a temple that is built over the sort of rift to the underworld. But all this is to sort of demonstrate that, the text is really interested in sort of casting royal power as inherently self-oriented. And for usual models of Indian kingship, in a way, this isn't problematic, because in fact, the king's enjoyment of personal pleasure and prosperity is often understood to just ramify throughout his own realm. But the Navanāthacaritramu is sort of drawing out these kind of alternative, these sort of contradictions of this model, and ultimately saying that it doesn't work. But in its place, it does offer a sort of alternative vision, I would say, of a kind of ascetic sovereignty. And this often comes out when the text speaks of yoga samrajyam. So Matsyendra is often said to sort of preside over his disciples and in fact much of the world in this state of yogic sovereignty. So sort of the sovereignty that seeks power and sort of holds power, but shows no interest in directly enjoying it. It's not self-oriented, and at best it's purely generous and benevolent, and even will sort of offer prosperity at the sort of siddha yogis sort of own expense. I would say the only story that offers a kind of workable model of siddha yogi relations is in the story of Nagarjuna's disciple, Atreya, who, and this is the story of this siddha through alchemical practices, trying to turn the great mountain of Srisailam to gold. And in the course of this, he makes a pact with the king, who becomes his disciple and protector. But also, I mean, the ultimate goal of turning Srisailam into gold is to, in fact, kind of eliminate inequality, when sort of wealth inequality in particular. But even this, even if it offers a workable model of relationships between a siddha and a king, is in a way depicted as being unsustainable, because Vishnu, as he often does, arrives on the scene to sort of maintain the usual hierarchical ordering of society. So just to sort of wrap up here so that we can have some time for questions, the Navanāthacaritramu ultimately, I would suggest, kind of celebrates an idea of kind of rule of power that's founded on renunciation and asceticism. Even so, right, as I just mentioned, the models that it does present that are positive are ultimately rendered inconceivable. And they're undone by one or the other party's arrogance. So in the case of this final story I mentioned of Atreya, even though he's depicted as kind of being ultimately generous and benevolent, he is also mentioned as kind of basically wanting to be an alchemical celebrity. And so it's this kind of thing, this sort of concern with sort of pride, that Vishnu, when he comes to undermine Atreya, sort of goes after and sort of takes as one of the reasons for contravening it. Even so, I would say that this larger kind of narrative argument resonates with the religious and political world of Srisailam in the 14th and 15th centuries. So I would say, so specifically, I think in sort of thinking through the sort of political potential and associations of ascetics, I think the text points us to think about a little bit more about the place of Gaurana's patron, the ascetic potentate Muktishanta, who was the sort of presided over the Bhikshavritti Mata at Srisailam, and seemed to have a sort of, in fact, a larger sort of role as a superintendent over the sort of complex of Srisailam itself, based on the epigraphical evidence. And I would say, I mean, I think this is marked, in fact, precisely by the sort of rising political fortunes of the Bhikshavritti leaders in the 14th and 15th century. So kind of starting with Muktishanta, they sort of seemingly gain sort of increasing levels of power over Srisailam and in the region, and later inscriptions of sort of disciples or seemingly potentially sons of Muktishanta hold significant political, economic, and even military power in the greater Srisailam region. And I think we in a way we find a direct parallel to the text in the story of Atreya, because we see a kind of sort of naming practice that is replicated among in the Bhikshavriti sphere. So Nagarjuna's student Atreya, the only way that he kind of has a good relationship with the king is that the king becomes his disciple and takes on his name. So the king gets rid of his older name and becomes Tyaga Nagarjuna, following Atreya's own name as sort of this Nagarjuna Shishya. And we see this sort of echoed actually in the epigraphical and literary evidence in the case of a potentate from the Deccan named Mumuksu, who was named after and clearly a disciple of Muktishanta, Bhikshavriti Raya. So, and I think more broadly, the Bhikshavriti Rayas, and aside from sort of encouraging sort of, in this case, the Navanāthacaritramu, I think they have a lot, they seemingly, based on the sort of project of the great architectural reliefs that some of the images that I showed at the beginning of the talk are drawn from, on the sort of walls around the Mallikarjuna temple at Srisailam. They were commissioning these works at precisely the same period that they would have been commissioning the Navanāthacaritramu. So they clearly have this sort of larger interest in sort of kind of celebrating a kind of siddha and yogic culture at Srisailam. And I think the Navanāthacaritramu participates in this larger project. But I think part of the project, I mean, that I would emphasize is that in fact, it's sort of capacious realization, right? It's not precisely not limited to a kind of Nāth Sampradāya, but I think they're trying to sort of portray Srisailam precisely as this kind of place for siddhas, for these esoteric practices, for yogic practices, as well as I think also it's kind of shoring up its status as Srisailam, as the Srisailam, right? Because we, in fact, there are sort of, in some cases, these competing claims, and two sometimes where Srisailam is in the Deccan. But I think they're sort of trying to sort of centralize the traditions around Srisailam and siddha practices at their site. And Gaurana's Navanāthacaritramu is meant to participate in that. So I'll stop there and yeah, let's
Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Jamal. That was great. Maybe we can stop sharing the screen. I don't know.
Yeah,
doesn't really matter. Oh yeah, that's better. Thank you. Yeah, that was fantastic. I could have listened to you keep going for hours. And it makes me want to read your thesis again. I got loads of questions, but there are quite a few on the Slido as well, and we haven't got that much time, so I'll have to pick one of my questions. So Muktishanta, who was the Gaurana's patron, do we know anything about his caste background? You know, if there's all this stuff against Kshatriyas and so forth, is there some tension in that? I mean, do we know anything about that? Was he like a Brahmin, wasn't he, or not?
I mean, it's unclear actually. I mean, from my reading, I mean, most of what we get and the couple of inscriptions and descriptions that we have. So these come in the Navanāthacaritramu, is where actually we get, I would say, the lengthiest description to my knowledge. There's another text in poem in Telugu by the poet Natha, who is a contemporary of Gaurana. So in his Shivaratri Mahatmyamu, he names his patron as this Mumuksu, who is portrayed as the disciple of Muktishanta. And so I think because in fact the connection is kind of a couple of steps away, we don't get very much about Muktishanta in the Shivaratri Mahatmyamu. And I think there's some confusion here even about, because of the sort of naming practices, people taking on names of their sort of gurus and fathers and things like that. Some of it is still to me a little ambiguous. But I would say in the Navanāthacaritramu and in the Shivaratri Mahatmyamu, the little that we get, and then in some inscriptions from the middle of the sort of middle of the 15th century, Muktishanta, I mean, we don't get much about his background. I mean, he's sort of sort of praised as he is, which is as this kind of ascetic king. He's literally a Yatishwara. And he's sort of portrayed, he's praised in the inscription then by Gaurana using the tropes that are used to describe royal figures. But we don't get, but that's sort of a praise of him as he presides, in the present. So yeah, I mean, I haven't been able to sort of detect or sort of pull out the bits about his background, but I mean, I'd be interested to hear what others might think or know, because I'm still in some ways working through the evidence.
Was he, do we know, I mean, because as you say, he kind of had military and he was, building reservoir. He was like a king, wasn't he? Vikshavritti, the king of Vikshavritti. Was he under any bigger king, any, actual king that we know of? Was there, was part of the idea of the Navanāthacaritramu to kind of tell this other king that they were, they were behaving badly, and then in fact that Muktishanta was the best ruler around.
Yeah.
Do we know that?
I think, so there we're writing, so Gaurana is writing right sort of in the sort of period where Vijayanagara is kind of achieving ascendancy. I think, in the early years, it's maybe not quite so settled, and there's the other families in the region that they're competing with, the Recharas and the Reddys in particular.
Okay. That might have been some of that. That might have been what.
So I think that's some of it. But I think, I think later, so his son or grandson, Lingaya, is explicitly named as having having a military, and we have records in some later collections. So this, what is it, the Recharla sort of Vamshavali text, which is sort of assembled probably in the 16th or 17th century, of sort of praises of these Recharla kings who find their way into more into Tamil country. But we find reference to actually the Bhikshavritti Raya's military fighting with these like Vijayanagara generals. I think, he's definitely, they're definitely trying to be like, we are just independent, I would say. That's definitely coming through.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. So we haven't got that long. We've only technically got 5 minutes, and we've got plenty of questions, lots of questions. The one at the top of the Slido is Lucy May Constantini. So if it's possible to go to her, that would be great.
Lucy, you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, hi, thank you very much for that. It was really fascinating. It's a really quite straightforward question. You touched on it towards the end, but I was just hoping you could give a little bit more context as to like the geography of this poem, like where exactly is it thought to have emerged and in what kind of a context?
Right. So yeah, it's Gaurana is very clearly writing at Srisailam, so in this great temple complex in the Deccan, where the central deity is Mallikarjuna Swami. Gaurana himself seems to be potentially a devotee of this Mallikarjuna's consort, Brahmarambika. But I would say it's sort of geographically, it's sort of, Srisailam is kind of a center for, as I was touching on this sort of Virashaiva community that sort of spans, Karnataka, especially Andhra, and goes to point south and to other parts of the Deccan. And he's clearly, I think, kind of a part of, sort of assimilating many of these traditions, and he's using their sort of, in Telugu, their favorite verse form for long compositions, which is Dvipada. But I would say, in fact, like Gaurana is probably coming from a little farther north in the Deccan and kind of more like Telangana, because of his family connections to this dynasty, the Recharla dynasty, which is a sort of short-lived power in the area, that kind of emerged in Telangana, Andhra, in the 14th century. But sort of contextually, I would say that, I would really could have centered Gaurana at Srisailam even if I wouldn't sort of center his participation in the sort of Virashaiva world, if only because I think he has sort of other commitments, and is sort of, I think he's seemingly kind of like a classically trained poet who's sort of acting sort of opportunistically in the region, because there are a lot of maybe like minor dynasties that aren't as powerful now, given sort of the rise of the Jayanagara, the rise of kind of more kind of Persianate culture in the Deccan as well. And so he's, I think, found his way to this great temple, Srisailam, which, where, there are these powers there that are in fact trying to kind of build something of a court, a more sort of traditional kind of Sanskritic, let's say, court in the area. I don't know if that gets to some of your concerns, but
That's great, thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks. So next question, and he's got a comment and a question as well. Amol Bunker, if we can go to him.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, hello, Jamal. Actually, I'm also working on some old Marathi sources.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of you. Yes.
And they are very parallel to your work, actually. So we have the story of this Chaurangi in our Marathi work from 13th century. And it is very interesting for you that the story of Allama and Goraksha, there is one parallel of the story. It is available in Marathi. Yeah. So in the Marathi version, there is an argument between Goraksha and this Virupa. Mm-hmm. And this Gauraksha defeats this Virupa, and this Virupa is converted from Vajrayana to Shaiva. So maybe these two stories, they may have some prototype. Or yeah. And another question is, do you have any references of Ghoda Choli and Siddha Kaneri in your this text?
Let me say that we do have a long list of disciples that are named. We do have Ghoda Chuda named, for instance. And then what was the other name? Let me check the slide.
Kaneri. He was disciple of Nagarjuna.
Canary. No mention of Canary that I can.
Actually, he's mentioned as Arya Deva in Tibetan tradition.
Okay.
So this Ghoda in Marathi text, we have reference that Ghoda Choli was related with this Telugu region. Actually.
Okay.
He was living near Kishkinda.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So yeah, there's a brief. So the mention of a lot of them come in the last chapter. At the beginning, there's a sort of list of sort of where the immediate disciples go, like which regions of India they go to, and then there's a list of their disciples accompanying that.
Okay. Okay, then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Jamal, we're already a minute over. Do you mind if we go on for sort of an extra 10 minutes or something?
Yeah.
We've got plenty of questions. Okay, so the next one is Hari, please. If we can go to Hari. Next, then the rest are anonymous.
Harry, you can unmute yourself now. Harry, you should be unmuted.
Hello, Hari. Oh, here we go.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Harry. We can hear something, but I don't know if can you try again.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, that's a lot better.
Okay. Hi. So I was just how much.
Oh, Now you've dropped out. But Harry, if you've got a problem with the connection, I mean, I can, because I can see your question. Maybe I should read it out. It's going to be save some time. So the
Okay,
question.
go ahead.
Oh, I don't think we. I think your connection's too weak, Harry. So hopefully you can hear, because I'm going to read your question out, and then we can. If you can't, you can always listen back in the recording. The question is, how much interaction was there between Hindu, in scare quotes, and Buddhist Nāths and siddhas in Andhra Pradesh at this time? Did they see themselves as clearly distinct? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I wonder if you're, if you're even, there's even any evidence of Buddhist siddhas as such, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can speak too much to that. I mean, I don't know what kind of evidence there is to kind of to answer that question well. You know, I mean, I think, I mean, as I sort of mentioned, or I mean, as I'll try to kind of bring together with some of the work that, you know, I'm sort of I'm aware of from what, you know, Jim and the Dr. Yoga Project are doing, right? I mean, there's clearly, I mean, there's some kind of connection, or I don't know how we want to sort of think about that kind of sort of broader siddha culture that may be, you know, kind of involve practitioners who might take one affiliation or the other. But I mean, based on the evidence I have from, you know, the sort of Telugu literary sources that I'm most familiar with, I mean, this tradition is basically portrayed as the kind of Hindu, or I mean, ultimately a Shaiva tradition. I mean, Matsyendra is recognized as Shiva, as an embodiment of Shiva himself. And, you know, that carries through the sort of other references and sort of contexts that I can take. And I mean, I would say, you know, kind of thinking back to the Bhikshavriti Rayas again, that, right, I mean, they are, whatever they are Shaiva, and they are, I think, you know, interested in sort of claiming a certain, you know, we might say kind of Shaiva sort of affiliation and sort of umbrella over these kind of siddha traditions, and the sort of these sort of siddha figures. I mean, who they're clearly, I mean, they're sort of referenced very briefly in the prologue as sort of, you know, sort of sitting in the court maybe of Bhikshavriti, of the Bhikshavriti Rayas, that there are these kind of these siddha yogi, these great siddha yogis who are there. And I think, you know, based on Gaurana's use of Dvipada, which, I mean, just to say, is like a literary form, but has some kind of folk kind of vernacular song tradition association, which I'm still trying to sort of describe. I mean, he's clearly kind of doing some kind of compilation work. So, I mean, I think we have these stories that are circulating. I mean, I think Amol's question and comments kind of speak to that, right? I mean, we have these stories that are sort of circulating, probably orally, you know, maybe in some kind of, you know, who knows exactly what forms, multiple forms, but they're being, you know, kind of, in this case, you know, crystallized in this kind of Shaiva work. But that's the best I can do.
Yeah, I mean, as from my reading of your work, it's never mentioned that, for example, Virupaksha is Buddhist, is it?
No.
There's a mention of Buddhism within that. I mean, there's I've written a little bit about the minister in Mangalore, Mangalapura, who's Siddha Buddha, isn't he? Or Buddha Siddha. So maybe there's some implication there.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. We won't be able to get through them all, I don't think, but there's a couple. They're all anonymous, so I've got to read them out. There's a couple that are quite similar. So the first one is this story about power and challenging those who have power. And then the other question is, I often find that Nathas are considered a counterculture to Brahmanism. Is this evident in the Navanāthacaritramu? Some seem to be upper caste by identity. And I suppose that also ties in with Virashaivism, which I guess is sort of nascent at that time, but also is seen as a challenge to caste hierarchy as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, so I would say, I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, just to kind of start at one level, I mean, Gaurana is, I mean, he's a Brahmin, and like very proudly so. And as I mentioned in his sort of Sanskrit work on Poetics, I mean, basically his argument there, I mean, if we can kind of think about him as having kind of consistent worldview, his argument is that, you know, at least we can say in a kind of religious or metaphysical sense, only Brahmins should be poets, or should be poets that maybe like kings accept poetry from, right? If we think about kind of a poem as like some kind of object or gift. But within the text, I would say actually, yeah, most of them are upper caste by, I mean, most of these siddhas, except for Goraksha, are coming from either Kshatriya or identified as Kshatriya or Brahmin. Many are Kshatriya. I mean, we have, so Siddha Buddha is a Brahmin, probably. We have Kanika Siddha, who's just kind of mentioned briefly, is a Brahmin sage living in a Himalayan ashram before he sort of becomes initiated. He's sort of like a kind of older sort of tapaswin type who kind of turns the corner into the sort of Siddha yoga. And then, yeah, most others are Kshatriyas. So, I mean, I would say it is, in a sense, in one sense, it's not countercultural. I mean, it's sort of establishing certain kind of pedigrees for most of its members. But I think, in a way, I mean, it is sort of establishing a kind of separate sphere potentially. But I would say, yeah, I mean, as with the question that's coming out in a lot of the scholarship around the Veerashivas from people like Elaine Fisher, and especially, I wouldn't say it doesn't reject Brahmanism fully, or even, yeah, I mean, it's more of like a reorientation. But I mean, just in terms of who's actually depicted as being included in this world, I mean, they're sort of often in the sort of, you know, upper caste kind of upper varna folk.
Okay, well, thanks. I mean, so I think that's it really for questions, because yeah, we just hit 5-2. But I've got one or two questions, just quick ones. Any plans for publication, and related also, what about a translation of the whole text? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm working on it. Is the kind of the short answer. I'm sort of, yeah, I mean, I have this project, and then I'm sort of working on a sort of more a translation project and with sort of commentary
Of the whole Navanāthacaritramu.
Yeah,
great.
as well as, yeah, but I'm sort of also kind of maybe sort of working on that a little more slowly than sort of the other project on poetics and astrology and ritual.
Okay. And you've just got a new teaching job, so presumably that's keeping you quite busy as well.
But yeah, I'm sort of working on it, and sort of, yeah, I think I also need to kind of think through some of the other things. People, you know, talking to you and others, and you know, hopefully, yeah, connecting with people who are also working on the Marathi material like Amol, and because I have some more, I think, thinking in terms of, at least on the sort of commentary sort of analysis side.
I feel a workshop coming on.
Yeah.